I have lived and studied in this city prior to qualifying to become an architect and master planner at the University of Sarajevo 35 years ago. Today I'm not going to talk about any of my specific work. Instead, I will have a team which I've chosen specifically, which is more accurately an overview titled Timescale. It is a planetary title, and I will be referring to all subjects in this talk as Earthlings. It is only fair to say that the term Earthling is chosen specifically as a non-discriminatory term, as much as it would apply to each and every one of us dwellers who reside and share this planet. The timescale could be viewed as a sort of series of pros and cons, but it tends to put into perspective a totality of our collective actions in the past century. So we can later agree whether we can actually call it an achievement. The principle here resides on two-point term, time and the scale, with a little question mark in between. The time being a constant pendulum, with its might of its inevitability, which we can all agree it's a hard fact. Scale, on the other side, is a term that we can refer to as a measure of things. In this particular argument, it is a term used to describe a magnitude of the problem that we are facing at this point in time. A conundrum that requires a careful rethinking before we can attempt to do any of the resolving. In order to set some parameters for this, I have chosen some of our fellow Earthlings whose actions to date would hopefully help us to kind of move on to the happier notes. My favorite Earthlings, the top left, is Sir David Ademir, born in 1926 and fortunately still with us. This is the man who never stopped telling us as it is. Here's just one of his wise wordings. We only need to take 1/5,000th part of the energy the sun sprays on this earth each day to provide all the energy requirements of humanity. This is kind of a pretty important point. The Earthling number 2 is a young man by the name of Bojan Slat. He's an inventor and entrepreneur. He's Dutch. And he has single-handedly initiated the creation of technologies who are solving our problems, namely ocean garbage, Pacific, and all the other oceans are full of plastics. It's estimated 1.8 trillion pieces of plastics are floating around our oceans. He is the CEO and the founder of the Big Ocean Cleanup, and you should check that if you haven't, which develops advanced technologies and systems to rid the world's ocean of plastic. Really good news, the Bojan and his team are being very successful in the job that they're doing. Number 3 Earthling, his name is Dr. Ha-Jin Chan. He's an institutional economist. He wrote a book which is an international bestseller with the title 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. But the interesting part is that he wrote it like a cookbook, because he's a food lover. He said the food is so fundamental to our survival, happiness, our identity, that it's the best way to use it when you're talking about boring subjects like economy. In other words, wrapping a dry economy sort of arguments into succulent food format is really work there, which means he's getting his message across. Number 4 Earthling sounds like an oddball, but it is David Byrne, who was born in 1952. In 1984, he told us to stop making sense in a world that didn't make sense to him then. The title Stop Making Sense qualifies him instantly to become a part of this discussion. If you haven't seen the documentary, you can see the Spike Lee Broadway show called David Byrne's American Utopia, which is fantastic. You may ask yourself why these four, because that's beside the point. There are so many earthlings equally important from all walks of life that are amazing and doing good. Yes, they are right causes, as the ones I already mentioned here. But the main point here is, the right question is, have we listened to any of this? Have we understood any of those messages? And have we done anything about it? Most importantly, are we still listening to their messages? We have the pedestrian bridge in city of Dhaka in Bangladesh. That's not a zebra crossing. That's a plastic river. Then we have a space junk. There are millions of tons of redundant satellites that are orbiting around above our stratosphere, and we don't see it. So therefore, we don't think it's there. Our icebergs are melting rapidly, faster than any other time in our history. There's a tech junk. You know about it because it's our junk, right? Microplastics have already fused with a coastal rock, which means that they entered into our geology, and this is a serious issue. Facts are there too. We are still burning a kerosene in the air in order to breathe it back. I mentioned the icebergs. Our habitats and our cities are clogging up with things that we don't really need. And the most important part of this, the global production of disposable plastic bottles is still doubling each year. So there's another part which is different to the other parts of a junk. And it is a worrying junk that we all gradually sort of fallen victim of, or to, rather. Paradoxically enough, it's this giant amoeba-shaped cloud of information known as internet. To this date, my little brain hasn't really grasped the whole demise of this thing, but it's definite that, and certain that it's vast and it's multiplying in milliseconds or nanoseconds. Some would say, but this is democratic and everyone gets to have a say, which is true to a certain extent. However, given the history of our earthlings dealing with ocean plastic, space plastic, and junk, this idea, this democratic idea doesn't fill me with a great deal of optimism. Essentially, the worrying part of this is potential risk of the information overload, which will equate to misinformation. History should have taught us that every bad idea starts like a really good idea, until the earthlings take it apart in the middle of the process and it begins to lose its original meaning up until the point that it becomes unfit for its purpose. You all know, and we probably agree, that the information is everything. But at the same time, we can clearly see how useful the internet information is to us, and there are no questions about it. The issue is the filtering of this information and who is going to be or would be ultimately responsible for adequately providing this service. This means a new redefinition of our core values and the creation of a new set of binding criteria that we would ask all the earthlings to ultimately gradually start adhering to. Hopefully, this time, we're not going to leave this decision to the market. This time we must be much, much smarter. Our willingness today to manage the global transition of energy dependency and outlaw the detrimental activities that are starving the planet of its vital assets are becoming visually evident. So at present, we reached a point where we are already having a very tangible discussions about phasing the fossil fuels as yesterday's technology and give way to healthy and clean powers, which I think is a very, very good thing. And we can call it a progress. One relevant event on the separate note has caught my eyes is the American farmers have won the court case against the tractor maker John Deere, who agreed to give their customers, the farmers, it's called right to repair their own equipment that they already paid for, right? So this sell me twice mentality in the recent history has become, unfortunately, a norm for so many producers and sellers. Coupled with the restrictive policies of providing a spare part for longer periods and all the small print has resulted in an accumulation of unwanted and unsustainable junk, which obviously has a detrimental effect to the planet. After decades of so-called globalization, we finally realized that's not such a good idea. We have almost centralized our global trade and almost destroyed some of the perfectly valid local economies in this process. We are now trying to correct that. We also must accept one fact is that we are very good in creating junk, we know that. We are also over-efficient in certain areas and under-efficient in others. We got to get this in the right balance. And the balance is we need to start addressing the very serious problem. And that is the margins, the famous profit margins. We don't need excessive margins. Surely this planet can take a normal, good old decent margin without us becoming reckless in this process. As I briefly mentioned at the outset, my vocation allowed me to experience some of the direct consequences of our collective recklessness in the lack of planning or timely planning in the managing of the growth of our cities. As much as we would like to think that that every city in the world is a reflection or the mirror of the society, this doesn't mean that we cannot or can protect our cities from reflecting the altered state of mind of their current inhabitants. This is the condition called the urban sprawl. It generally happens to so many cities, but it's poorly planned. You have uncontrolled the explosion of suburbs, an adequate transport structure, social and commercial facilities, which inevitably breed social fragmentation and increases the chances of possible exodus of the indigenous population. In other words, it's an urban junk. Many cities suffer from it, but unlike any other forms of man-made junk that is some place far away, it's not on the Kardashian show, it's not on the Eurovision Song Contest. And this is the one which is in your neighborhood, and you can see it every day if you can only choose to see it. Let me give you another living example. I took an Uber ride in London, and the driver used to spend like 6 years Ubering in Rome before we moved to London for better life. So I asked him, how do you compare London to Rome? And he said, you know what? Having been doing this in London for 2 years, I think that it's no longer practical to live in this city. I mean, it's the word practical that really impressed me. And it is a very question that we should all be asking ourselves pretty immediately. By that I mean every one of us. What is practical in short, medium, and long term in our lives? It is that simple. So let us also not forget what Professor Harari has eloquently explained to us in his bestseller book, Sapiens, the a brief history of humankind. What separates us, humans or earthlings, from the entire animal kingdom is our ability to lie and deceive, as opposed to a lion or shark that will solely rely on their primary instinct and therefore being predominantly pragmatic. So, how did we get to the top of the food chain? Through lies and deceit. We lie to each other. But the problem here is we lie to ourselves. And some people call that denial, which is really the main subject of this talk. I think time is very short to address this subject, but I will try to summarize this little talk. We do have a planetary problem to resolve. We do have some amazing thinkers and visionaries amongst us, but they are not getting their messages across. Other earthlings, which we could call the busybodies, are not really listening. So we need to learn how to turn the good ideas into working solutions, like Boyan did. We do need to restart learning how to listen. And we definitely need to get practical. And thank you for listening.